Thank you everybody for joining us this evening. I'm delighted that so many people have signed up for this program, which is part of our ongoing series of public lectures in the humanities. The title of the program this evening is the Ray Allen Billington Lecture in the History of the American West, which originated in the mid-1980s in honor of Ray Allen Billington, who was a former senior research associate at the Huntington, for the specific purpose of addressing an aspect of the history and culture of Western America. Past lecturers have included Johnny Farragher, Carl Jacobi, Neil Foley, and Anne Hyde. I'm delighted to say that this evening's Billington lecturer is the writer, poet, and biographer Iris Jamahl Dunkle, who lives in Northern California and is poet laureate of Sonoma County. Obtained her MFA in poetry from New York University and a PhD with a focus in American poetry from Case Western University. This academic background encouraged her to unearth the forgotten stories of female writers of the West, not only through the writing of poetry, but also through what she calls revolutionary biography. Her latest collection of poetry, West, Fire, Archive, was inspired directly by the devastating wildfires of 2017, which she witnessed firsthand. But more generally, all her writing challenges the Western myth of progress by examining the devastating impact that agriculture and overpopulation have had and continue to have on the landscape of the American West. Her most recent book, and the reason why she was invited to give the Billington Lecture this evening, is Charmian Kittredge London, Trailblazer, Author, Adventurer. Published last year with the University of Oklahoma Press, the book questions and rewrites the narrative presented of Jack and Charmian London by fictional biographers like Irving Stone, and recreates Charmian's life from her own perspective. Tonight's lecture draws on material from the Huntington's collections to present Charmian not only as a literary trailblazer in her own right, but also as a woman of fortitude and bravery, characteristics which are more generally regarded as the masculine values which made the American West. As is usual with our Zoom lectures, the presentation itself has been pre-recorded, but we will handle the Q&A live. So please feel free to use the Q&A function on your Zoom toolbar to submit a question, and I will moderate the questions after we have heard the talk. So thank you all for being here, and without further ado, please welcome the Huntington's 2020 to 21 Billington Lecturer, Iris Jamahl Dunkle.
It is such a pleasure to be with you here tonight and to speak with you during National Women's Month about an incredible woman, Charmian Kittredge London. Before I begin telling you about her life, though, I want to thank a few people. To begin with, I want to thank the Huntington Library for inviting me to give this lecture and for opening your archives to me so that I could do this important research. I also want to give a special thanks to Sue Hodson for her tremendous help navigating the Jack London papers. And I'd like to thank the Jack London State Historic Park and Carol Dodge at the California State Parks. My publishers, the University of Oklahoma Press and the Center for Literary Publishing, for helping me tell this story far and wide. I'd like to thank Clarice Stas, whose early scholarship on Charmian and her support helped pave the way for my own research. And I'd like to thank Susan Nurnberg for her early collaboration on this project, and the Jack London Society, whose scholars have encouraged my work. And of course, I would like to thank my family, Matt, Jack, and Max, and my father, John, and my now deceased mother, Rebecca, all of whom have supported me as I've dedicated the last 6 years of my life to this project. So let's begin the talk about the American West with a quotation from W.S. Merwin's famous collection, The Lice. When you look back, there is always the past, even when it has vanished. Indeed, In the recorded and accepted story of the American West, parts of the past seem to have vanished. And for the most part, this vanished past seems to be the voices and lives of women. In the late 19th century, Frederick Jackson Turner equated Americanization with cultural traits of what it meant to be a Western American. Quote, coarseness and strength combined with acuteness and acquisitiveness, that practical, inventive turn of mind, quick to find expedients, the masterful grasp of material things, that restless, nervous energy. And perhaps most importantly, he added the phrase dominant individualism, which he believed had been shaped by forging new lives in the Western frontier. These ideas of individualism, entrepreneurship, and strength were embodied in the characters popularized in Western literature that followed. Even though the North American West was populated by women as well as men, and by Native Americans and immigrants of many nationalities. For the most part, dime novels and more serious Western literature depicted white men and not these others with dominant individualism. An androcentric literary West was created, which then was taken up by Hollywood and immortalized. But the good news is that the single story that defined the West is now being challenged. The good news is that when we shift our focus and look at this era through the perspective of women by researching their artifacts, we begin to see a truer West that is more representative of all of those who were involved. I'm here today to tell you about Charmian Kittredge London, a woman who was best known as being Jack London's wife, but who was so much more. Charmian lived a long life. She was born November 27th, 1871 in Wilmington, California, and she died January 14th, 1955 in Glen Ellen, California. Throughout her long life, Charmian was free-spirited and adventurous, and she defied modern expectations of femininity. I started on the journey of telling the story of Charmian's life largely due to a photograph. This photograph is one of the most iconic photos of Jack London. While I was writing my second poetry collection, There's a Ghost in This Machine of Air, which explores the history of Sonoma County, I discovered that Nathaniel Griffith, who is considered the grandfather of the Gravenstein apple, had 3 daughters, all of whom had been college educated in the late 1880s, which was unusual at the time. So, of course, I looked into these women. As it turned out, one of these daughters was a poet, Nell Griffith Wilson, who I later discovered was friends with Charmian. I found a copy of one of Nell's collections called Our Valley of the Moon in Poems and Pictures. In it, I found this version of the famous photograph with a clear attribution to Charmian. Of course, it was Charmian who was riding on Sonoma Mountain that day with Jack and who took the photograph. When I reached out to several scholars to see if they knew this information, each of them answered that they never thought to ask who had taken the photograph. Their answers made me start to wonder, what else do we not know about Charmian Kittredge London because we never thought to ask? What followed was a 6-year journey exploring the archives of the state park, the Bancroft, Utah State, private collections, and of course, the Huntington. The artifacts I found told a story I'd never heard before about a woman who didn't fit the description I had been given for her in all of the biographies that I had read about Jack London. From my research, I wrote 2 books. West Fire Archive, a poetry collection where I explore Charmian's maligned life using the poetic form to unstitch and re-sew her life, invigorating the old narrative with her forgotten attributes, her disregard of gender norms, her pioneer heritage, and her sense of adventure. And Charmian Kittredge London, trailblazer, author, adventurer. My biography about her life. The first full-length biography ever to be written about Charmian. I wrote these books in conversation with one another. I'd process the archival documents or objects through poetry before using them in my biography process. In this talk, I'll give you a short sample of each. So what can we learn about the American West from a corset, a diary, and a poem? Charmian lost her mother at the age of 5, but she kept her mother's memory alive through her artifacts, many of which are housed here at the Huntington. Pictured here is Charmian's mother, Dale Daisy Wiley Kittredge, her whalebone corset, her poem written about her daughter, Charmian, and pages from her many, many diaries. Long before she met Jack London, Charmian was raised in a literary family. Her mother documented their overland journey from Oshkosh, Wisconsin to Salt Lake City, Utah, in a journal that Charmian placed in the archives. Before and after her daughter Charmian was born, Daisy published her poems, short stories, and essays widely. Pictured here is her poem Charmian, originally published in Godey's Ladies' Book and Magazine in April 1877. Which offers us a glimpse into her talent as a writer and her love for her daughter. Daisy's whalebone corset was an object that Charmian kept with her throughout her life. She wrote in her diary about how she would place the corset around her waist in order to remember her mother, a scene that she would later help write in Jack London's novel, The Valley of the Moon, where the protagonist Saxon remembers her own poet mother by doing the exact same thing. One day, while I was visiting Jack London State Historic Park in Glen Ellen, doing research, Carol Dodge, the curator of the collection, showed me the corset, which at the time was housed in Charmian's old dresser in the House of Happy Walls, her previous home. At the time, I had just lost my mother to ovarian cancer, and the experience of seeing this artifact created this poem. Artifact. A whalebone corset, waist small enough to fit between two circled hands. On nights when stars pressed down and pinned their distance, Charmian wound those threaded bones around her own waist. Her mother's manuscripts, written in delicate ink, yellowing leaves of the cottonwoods that come fall raged red from the crags of the Wasatch Mountains. The tiny oval photo, her mother posed in a bonnet, midnight curls falling over her body as if to erase it. The oval photograph hangs where no one can see it. The manuscript sealed in vaults, only scholars wearing white gloves can read them. The corset, wrapped in white tissue paper, is stored in the dark mouth of Charmian's wooden dresser. My mother has only been gone a few months, so I carry her artifacts in my purse. A foldable hoof pick, a tiny wooden horse, the gold ring I once bought her on a trip to Stockholm, replica of one recovered from the Vasa, an enormous ship found sunk, completely intact. The weight of wood soaked and preserved by the clear harbor water. After years of restoration, they dredged it up, but the power and surge was gone. Daisy died on October 28, 1877, when Charmian was only 5 years old. But because Charmian saved her artifacts, we can still piece together Daisy's story. What follows is a short excerpt from my book recounting the Wiley family's overland journey, a story that was made possible thanks to the artifacts that Charmian saved, especially Daisy's diary recounting their overland journey. On the night of April 4th, 1865, a wall of fire swept through downtown Oshkosh, Wisconsin, when Jacob Scott Wiley, his wife, Catherine Growall, and their 7 children, of whom Charmian's mother, Dale, and her twin brother, Jay, were the eldest, had to flee their boarding house in the middle of the night. Weeks earlier, the Wiley family had left their rural log cabin in Delhi, 14 miles outside Oshkosh, in search of a better life. Delhi, once a trading post, had become a fading town built on burial grounds of the Ho-Chunk Indians. In the early days, settlers unintentionally dug up remains as they plowed their fields in the spring. There was only one road out, and it crossed a makeshift floating log bridge, which made it difficult to move crops. Without hope of a more efficient bridge in their future, many citizens, including the Wileys, left in search of a better place to make a living. Before the fire began in Oshkosh, the town had enjoyed a joyous night of celebration. The Confederate government's capital, Richmond, had fallen, signifying what many thought would be the end of the Civil War. And all-night cannons boomed and bonfires blazed in victory. 16-year-old Dale stayed up late with her siblings to watch the excitement unfold and to record the events in her diary. She began the diary to document her family's trip to California in a covered wagon train. She had been a writer from an early age and was senior editor of her school newspaper, Ocean Bells. She taught what she learned in school to her younger siblings who weren't able to attend school. Although none of the Wileys was injured in the fire, much of their supplies was lost, and their trip was delayed until they could replenish what was lost. Before they could leave, something unthinkable happened, delaying their trip even further. On April 14, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. Shops were shuttered, grown men and women wept openly in the streets, and everyone dressed in black for weeks. Then finally, as spring began to unfurl in the woods surrounding Oshkosh, the Wiley family began their overland journey west as part of a wagon train composed of 26 wagons. They formed a small contingent of the more than 20,000 people who crossed the overland trail that year. Only 4 years later, the wagon train was superseded by the opening of the Transcontinental Railroad on May 10, 1869. Along the way, the Wiley family camped almost exclusively at Army-guarded stations for 2 reasons. First, because the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho were fighting back against the influx of whites settling their land. And second, as they neared Salt Lake, to protect them from attacks by Mormons. The stage stations were packed with both passengers and cargo wagon trains. At night, the wagons were circled to protect their passengers, and sometimes a dance would be held around the flames of the campfire. One day, gazing from her perch in the wagon at the station ahead, Daisy was shocked out of her monotony. Great piles of smoking ashes strewn with charred household items and a lone calico bonnet were scattered across the road. Vultures circled and picked at the piles. When they arrived at the station, they discovered their family had narrowly missed being involved in an attack. Trouble followed them as they continued south. According to Dale's younger brother, Harley, who was 10 at the time of their trip, part of their wagon train was cut off and destroyed by Indians. Their travels took them through the Black Hills and the Platte River Valley, Rock Springs Station, Medicine Bow Creek, and Fort Halleck before they arrived in Salt Lake City. Salt Lake City was still a rough, developing city, divided between the Mormons, who had settled it, and the new Gentile pioneers, more and more of whom were arriving each day. The Army was trying to establish non-Mormon businesses in addition to the many Mormon-run businesses. During the year they spent in Salt Lake, the Wiley family established and operated a boarding house. And Daisy and her sister Tissy, who both dreamed of becoming teachers, opened the first Gentile school. Weekly dances were held at Camp Douglas, where it's likely that Daisy met her future husband, Willard Kittredge. The officers at the dance were a sight for sore eyes for the educated Wiley sisters, who during their overland journey had only had the company of the few young males they traveled with. They were attractive, educated young women who likely gained a lot of attention from the officers who attended the dances. 18-year-old Daisy had long curly hair and big doe eyes. She was small, but full of energy and curiosity. The night she walked into the dance and saw Kit standing by the wall in his uniform, she was swept off her feet. Although he was 18 years her senior. As Charmian recalled later, Dale wasn't the only one who was charmed by the dashing officer. The whole Wiley family fell romantically in love with blonde Kit. Daisy and Kit were married in a simple ceremony on October 6, 1866. The Wiley family left for California the day after their wedding, probably motivated by the need to move on and find better financial prospects. When they left, they took from Daisy her closest friends and confidants, her younger sister Calissa, who went by Tissy, and Nanetta, who went by Netta. As the Wiley clan moved west from Utah to Sacramento and eventually down to Southern California, Daisy plotted how she could be reunited with them, especially when she learned from Netta's letters of the trouble they faced along the way. Their wagon was overtaken and 2 of their cattle were lost. Daisy's rash decision to marry someone who would separate her from her family can only be explained by the charm and character of Willard Kittredge. As I mentioned, my process working with the artifacts was to write poetry first and then write the prose of my biography. When I encountered Daisy's diary and letters about her time in Salt Lake City, where she became quite depressed when she was separated from her family, and her solo journey by stagecoach from Salt Lake City to Buena Vista, California, to be reunited with her family, I wrote this poem. Origin story, Mother, 1870. By then, she's married the Army captain, and her family has gone west. By then, she knows 2 muddy ruts can lead to an undiagrammable sentence. The Wasatch Mountains rise, knuckled fists around her throat. Her husband, a bee stinging a map. Hold it to the right light, and the lace makes a trail out. By then, she's gone mute, buried under her own blank diary pages. Time unfurls its magnolia petal tongues until she leaves the city alone, young girl looking at the cataract eye of Salt Lake from the window of the rocking stagecoach. She tries to make sense of the change from brackish water and taut sand bellies to rise of sheer rock toward robin blue sky. Time moves molasses slow. For comfort, she cracks open a geology textbook, finds the story written on the land. A long sentence that leads to scent of sage, cool silk of sand at dawn. That leads to a long valley transformed into grassy hillsides, the rocky breath of the sea. Leads to her young brothers, grown large as men, her sisters knitting and Eden out of Kansas tents. So who was Charmian Kittredge London before she met Jack London? By looking through the lens of Charmian's artifacts, we find a very different story about who Charmian was before she met Jack London. Charmian attended college, traveled the world, had a high-paying job at the largest shipping firm in San Francisco before she met Jack London in 1900. This section of the biography talks about when Charmian attended Mills Seminary and College in Oakland, and her life after she graduated. Charmian enrolled in a non-degree program, taking classes in drawing, piano, rhetoric, literature, and art history. She lived on campus in a dormitory room. Life on the spacious grounds of Mills College was a pleasant change from life in the Ames household. Here she could wander the winding paths that followed the flow of Leona Creek and speak with classmates that hailed from far and wide. Her art class was held in a space filled with the customary replicas of classical sculpture, and Charmian would later buy a small copy of the Venus de Milo, which she kept in her room wherever she lived, a reminder of her first taste of independence. Susan Mills offered Charmian a new way to structure and record her daily life. Every day, Mills College students completed exercises, including a mile-long walk, a ritual Charmian would adopt and practice throughout her life. Even aboard ship, she would find a way to walk around the deck for at least a mile and more often 4 or 5. Her innate sense of discipline was valued and encouraged at Mills. And because of this, she began to record in her diary the things she had accomplished, the number of hours she sat at the piano and practiced, the number of miles she walked, and the titles and authors of the books she was reading. Most important, Charmian's life at Mills College gave her a gateway to the rest of the world. Her secret life no longer had to be kept secret. All around her in the dorms and in her classes were like-minded young women who aspired to become artists and intellectuals. For once, Charmian no longer felt like an outsider. She was among her peers, all of them accomplished young women eager to make their mark in the world. According to a notice in the Oakland Tribune, Charmian left Mills when she finished her course of study in June 1888, and Netta, her aunt, invited her to come live with her in her new house on Parker Street in Berkeley. Charmian agreed, but she insisted on renting the 2 rooms she would live in from her aunt so that she could maintain some of her hard-won independence. She took a job at the Harding and Forbes shipping firm as a stenographer at $30 a month. Charmian saved this money, and before long, she hired a Swedish woman named Hannah to do her cleaning and laundry. She also managed to purchase a rental property, thanks to an inheritance from her father and an uncle in Maine. Charmian took care in decorating her newly rented rooms in Netta's house, which she called her den. Her shelves were filled with books, and every surface held reproductions of her favorite marble sculptures. She hung paintings on the walls and installed an upright piano and what she called an, quote, absurdly elaborate little tea table. Each morning, as she sat at her dressing table, crowned with photos of her family and friends, pinning back her chestnut hair, she thought about the day ahead of her. She would join the commuters at Dwight Way Station and take a key route rail car to the ferry terminal, where she would take a ferry across the bay to San Francisco waterfront. Her office was a few blocks walk up Market Street and then a right turn to 212 Sampson Street. At Mills, Charmian developed her interest in music into a serious practice as a pianist. Her aunt had finally taught her how to play piano when she turned 10. After work, she practiced for hours in her den. She took weekly lessons, and her piano teacher encouraged her to give several public concerts, including one in 1890 at Irving Hall on Post Street in San Francisco. When she wasn't practicing the piano, she was out riding a rented horse until she could save enough of her salary and rental property income to buy a horse of her own. She rode in the Berkeley Hills and insisted on riding astride. For a woman to ride astride on cross saddle was still a very controversial issue, even though many young women were already riding bicycles. Charmian refused to ride side saddle because she found it both dangerous and cumbersome. But women's fashions were not intended for riding in this way. So Charmian designed her own split skirt, a skirt she converted into loose pants, kind of like culottes. Ray Edward Bennett, a neighbor of the Ameses, wrote of seeing Charmian riding in Berkeley in the late 1890s when he was only 8 years old. Quote, "The first glimpse of Charmian Kittredge sparked a bright, windy morning in Berkeley when, with tresses flying, she galloped past our cottage on Dana Street, astride a white horse, shouting, 'I am a Valkyrie,' to a startled child, and vanished down the highway in a cloud of dust." Riding empowered her, so it's not surprising that Charmian identified with the Norse women warriors. One of the facts about Charmian's life that had all but been forgotten is the fact that she was also a writer. Charmian published articles in the Overland Monthly and Sunset magazine before she even met Jack London. She edited and indeed helped write many of Jack's works, including writing whole passages of the novel The Valley of the Moon. And beginning in 1907, when she and Jack began their cruise of the Snark around the South Seas in a small yacht, she pursued her own life as a writer. In the following passage from my book, I recount Charmian's excitement about writing her own book, and I give a glimpse into the first leg of their journey from San Francisco to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. What's important to remember when I read this passage is how much of Charmian's perspective about the Snark journey had been erased from Jack's version of the story. And it's by bringing together the letters that Charmian wrote to her Aunt Netta, her own personal diaries, along with her account in the Log of the Snark, the book she would write about this era, that I was able to find more of a truer story of this time. How free Charmian must have felt that first day of their journey, standing on the deck of their boat as it finally sailed through the green-hilled mouth of the Golden Gate out to the open sea and the adventures that lay ahead. They would travel for nearly 2 years, visiting 7 major islands: Hawaii, the Marquesas Islands, Tahiti, Bora Bora, Fiji, Samoa, and the Solomon Islands, before their adventure ended abruptly in Sydney, Australia, because Jack developed a strange and troubling sickness. That their long anticipated cruise around the world would not last the full 7 years they had planned did not dampen the creative output that resulted from it. 5 books were written about the voyage: Jack's The Cruise of the Snark, Martin Johnson's Through the South Seas with Jack London, and Charmian's Log of the Snark, Our Hawaii, and Our Hawaii Island and Islanders. Each book recounts the journey differently. Jack's book, which was originally published as articles he wrote along the way, read like a collection of disparate mishaps and events rather than the story of the journey. Martin's book sensationalized and, in the London's opinion, fictionalized many of the events that took place during the trip and acted as a springboard for his future career as a travel writer and documentary filmmaker. Charmian took the approach she had followed in recording her trips to Europe, Jamaica, and Cuba. One sees the influence of Joshua Slocum's book, Sailing Alone Around the World, a book that had long inspired this adventure. However, few women had ever written about a trip like the one she planned to write about, and the thrill of blazing this trail made her writing project even more exciting to her. She would write chronologically, a daily log to capture not only Jack's adventures, but her own. Writing the Log of the Snark shifted something in her. By the end of the journey, Charmian saw herself as a writer. She'd always been inclined to write down all that she saw around her, but on board the Snark, This impulse developed into a well-crafted book-length log of their adventures in the South Seas, and into another 2 books about the time they spent in Hawaii. Being at sea freed her of some of the duties of being Jack London's wife, and gave her the opportunity to step back into her natural independence and her inclination toward travel writing. As she explained in a letter to her Aunt Netta, writing about the Snark voyage made her feel like herself again. Quote, I seem to be coming into my own in a way, getting back some practical results of my literary atmosphere, which was education at home with you and yours, and the rigorous following up of that education in my life with Jack. Without office life to vex and distract, my life is now all education. The very living of it is such, and the work I do for Jack is practical education, and there's no let up. Wouldn't it be fine to go on writing? Perhaps I shall. The thought of not only creating, but publishing a book thrilled her, as she revealed in the same letter, quote, I have a book on the market. The public, the press, and the crowd had been hard on Charmian since she married Jack, and his outsized personality left little space for her to be herself. She knew she was one of the first American women to embark on and to record a journey in a small yacht through the South Seas, and she did a great deal of research to prepare herself. The Londons brought more than 500 books aboard the Snark. Among them, Charmian included the best travel writing about the islands they would visit so that she would know what to look for and what she was looking at. But some of the places she would travel to had never been visited or written about before. Her research prepared her for the drastic changes that had taken place on the islands because of colonization, and gave her language to understand her own transformation on the immense sea in which the world floated. By the end of the trip, Charmian saw herself as a writer and would slowly begin to put her own creative life above Jack's. It was a shift that Jack would initially encourage, but eventually, as Charmian's focus shifted away from him, began to resent. A few hours after they set sail, a wave soaked Charmian's typewriter, leaving it almost inoperable, and everyone aboard became desperately seasick. She was only able to begin her log of her experiences on the trip at 3 days out, once the boat had reached deep water. It was the first time she had ever seen deep water, and its purple hue was so otherworldly, it reminded her of the dreamlike images painted by Maxfield Parrish in The 7 Voyages of Sinbad the Sailor, a treasured book from her childhood, in the old clapboard house in Oakland. Soon they encountered creatures she had never seen before. Clouds of purple man-of-war, jellyfish sailing on the water's surface, and many goonies, birds that looked like dark gray overgrown seagulls. 4 days into their voyage, the boat hit rough water, and they discovered that the Snark would not heave to. They couldn't fix the position of the helm and sail to make it possible for the ship to steer its own course without anyone at the helm. Someone would always need to be on watch. That day, they also discovered that the sea anchor had failed, so if a storm hit, it would be difficult to stabilize the boat. Jack was utterly disappointed, and so was Charmian. Their long dreamed of adventure was off to a rocky start. The inexperienced crew, many of whom had never been at sea, consisted of the captain, Charmian's uncle Roscoe Ames, the cook, Martin Johnson, the cabin boy, Tochichi, and Bert Stoltz, the engineer. Charmian was the only woman in the confined space of the yacht. She spent many frustrating hours on her hands and knees, scouring the greasy littered floors of the engine room, the bathroom, and the 2 staterooms, which had not been cleaned before they left port. As she records in her diary, "We were all filthy on a filthy boat." Except for Jack, the sick and demoralized crew still couldn't leave their bunks, so much of the work fell upon her. She had known life at sea would be difficult, but was most surprised by the number of bruises she acquired from falls and bumps on the ship. Every inch of her seemed to be black and blue. As she records in the log, quote, "The smallness of the boat, the nearness of the water, and particularly the size of the waves would about wreck a nervous woman. Charmian, however, as she would record in the log, was not a nervous woman who needed special treatment. She quickly grew into what was required of her life at sea. Evenings, as the wind pushed their yacht forward, Charmian would sit with Jack, watching the copper-streaked sky before the sun set, and the sky filled with the clarity of stars. Charmian, who had carefully selected books she would read on the boat aboard the Snark, read and heavily annotated Isabella Lucy Bird's book, The Hawaiian Archipelago, 6 Months Among the Palm Groves, Coral Reefs, and Volcanoes of the Sandwich Islands. Bird, like Charmian, was a woman not bound by convention. She rode astride and often dressed in trousers. Although her book was written over 30 years before the Snark journey, it is no wonder that Charmian resonated with the work of a woman with whom she had so much in common. Such works gave her access to a literary tradition that helped shape her own writing. While on board, Charmian quickly realized that normal female attire would not allow her to do the work she needed to do on the boat. So she began wearing her, quote, blue flannel bloomers. Instead, pants she had made for working aboard the boat. When Jack saw her wearing pants on deck, he admired her androgyny, calling her his, quote, twin brother and sweetheart. Somehow, in the confined space of the Snark, they found privacy enough to make love, and Charmian records each, quote, lolly in her diary. I'd like to end my talk with the story behind some of my favorite photographs of Charmian, which were taken by Hansel, Mieth, and Otto Hagel when they visited the Jack London Ranch in 1943. This is right after she had finished building the House of Happy Walls and moved in. On a cool fall day in 1943, nearly 7 years after she'd begun the project, the young photographers Hansel Mieth and Otto Hagel visited her at the House of Happy Walls. This was just 5 years before Mieth would become the second woman photographer to join the staff of Time magazine. Her husband, Hagel, worked as a freelancer for Life magazine and as President Franklin Roosevelt's official photographer. They'd recently purchased a ranch nearby and arranged to visit and photograph Charmian because they had long admired their work. Their documentary-style photography was reminiscent of Jack and Charmian's photographic attempts to capture human dignity, especially in the people who had been cast off or forgotten by society. When they arrived, Charmian took the couple on her sacred walk to the hillside where Jack was buried and the nearby ruins of Wolf House. Photos from that day show Charmian posed in the ruins of Wolf House, dressed in her rugged riding clothes, a wide smile spread across her face. She looks content, as if she is smiling into the beautiful ruins of her life. When they returned to the House of Happy Walls, Hansel and Mieth continued to take photographs of Charmian and the house. One photo in particular, pictured here, shows her seated at her desk in her large bedroom on the second floor, green visor pulled low. Her desk is covered with papers and books. Notes are pinned to pieces of paper as if she is physically trying to pull the story back together. The threads she is following to fill in the gaps of her story seem endless. It has been my absolute honor to give you a glimpse into the two books that I've written about Charmian Kittredge London. I hope my work inspires you to go out and discover the lives of women who have been vanished by the past. As it is only when we tell these stories that the true West will actually emerge. Thank you.
You read excerpts from the biography, the mode of writing is almost interchangeable in the two. This is biography in poetic mode and poetry in biographical mode. But you say that the poetry precedes the writing of the biography, right? So I'm wondering whether the biography would have been possible for you without your poetic imagination.
Well, I definitely experienced the artifacts visually, so and emotionally first. And in fact, the first object that I became really attached to in the archives at the Huntington Library were the Dirigo diaries. They have several different versions of the diaries that she wrote while she was on the Dirigo going from Baltimore around Cape Horn to Seattle. And she went through so many versions of them and she never actually published it. It was a book she was working on in that photograph that I showed her at her desk. That's what she's working on. And so I started a series of poems right away, kind of processing almost a docu-poetic. So using her lines interspersed with my own as a way to process that kind of loss that she was feeling and the story she was trying to make that she was never able to make. But no, I don't think I could have written the book without writing poetry as well. It's part of my process. I visually, see a story and then I can slow down and make the prose.
So there's poetry, there's prose, but the archive somehow sits between. So could you triangulate that for us a little bit more in terms of the way you conceive of that relationship? Because it's a very unusual way of approaching the biographical enterprise.
It is. There is a tradition of lyric biography that is quite gorgeous. And I did, that's how I first approached it. I was writing a lyric biography of Charmian. But what I found is I wanted this story to go wider than a lyric biography would go, because I wanted Charmian's voice to be brought back into the world for her story to be known. And so that's why that process became prose. There was more to say. I had a similar reaction to a previous book that I wrote about a town called Pit Hole, Pennsylvania, which was the first oil boom town in Pennsylvania, that I wrote a series of poems about and then eventually wrote a novel because there was a story that I needed to extend.
Right. So that was going to be my next question. In fact, why not write a novel about her, given that the poetic imagination is so critical to this enterprise? But it seems to you important that it was a biography rather than a fictionalized account.
Yes, there's a lot of, so the whole reason why I wanted to start this project was because her name had been taken and misappropriated, right? Like her story had been changed. And so for me to take that on and change her story in fiction felt wrong. So it felt very much like it was a nonfiction piece. That's just what I work in all genres, but this one, was asking for nonfiction.
Terrific, thank you. So there's a question in the Q&A there, which I will ask on behalf of Richard Caruco, I think. In your research, did you find any letters or correspondence between Charmian and Judy van der Veer in the late 1930s and early 1940s? Is that a connection that you're aware of?
I'm not aware of it right now, but I would certainly go back through my records and see if that if I have letters between the two of them. I'd certainly have a lot of letters from that time period. So I would highly encourage you to reach out to me through my website and contact me so that we can talk about it.
Okay, thank you. In terms of engaging with the London archive, especially the holdings at the Huntington, did you have particular frustrations about gaps or archival attrition? Because one of the challenges we all face in researching individuals is that the closer the focus, the more obvious the gaps in the archive become. Were there particular frustrations in this project for you?
Oh yes, there, of course. The biggest era, so there was two eras that were really frustrating. The first was Charmian's early life where she had burned her diaries. There's a single 1900 diary, but before that, she kept her diaries in the 1890s. But because of what happened with Irving Stone, she burned many of those diaries herself before she sent them to the Huntington. And so that era took a lot of research in other places besides archives because the information wasn't archived. And so a lot of what I call hard research of of really going to, through old newspapers and through city records and census data and all of that to kind of recreate that time period. But it was, and also another time period was right in the early 1900s as well, when right when she met Jack. She got rid of a lot of that information as well, as a way to kind of save the fact that they had a very early affair while he was still married, and they like to tell the story differently. And so there was some missing gaps there as well. And her very late life, because she had dementia as well. So even her birth certificate was wrong. I'm sorry, her death certificate, not her birth certificate.
Interesting. So there's a question here from Eliza. My aunt, says Eliza, lives near the ranch, and I've gone there a number of times. I've always been intrigued by the remnants of Wolf House, which is so haunting, and then her building of a final house elsewhere on the property. Would you like to elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, the Wolf House ruins, which are right behind me in this photograph, they are haunting for sure. I grew up going to the park, and they feel very solemn when you're actually there in front of them. There's all these redwoods that have survived since the burning, but the ruins are just these moss-covered rocks. And I think people who grew up in the valley, they used to like play on them, and but the reality is now it's roped off. But the House of Happy Walls, which is the house that Charmian built after Jack died, she didn't want to live in the cottage anymore, and so because she felt, like his presence there, and she wanted to make her own home. Like, she started off with the Den, which was her apartments in Berkeley, and the House of Happy Walls became the fruition of her dream of making her own home. And so she intended for it to originally to finally be a museum. And for a long time, it only really told Jack's story until a few years ago, the park completely remodeled it and brought in all of these scholars from across the United States and the world to help retell the story. And now Charmian has her own, basically her story is the top floor. It's called the Trailblazer exhibit. And it's amazing. I cried the first time I saw it.
I'm sure you did. Can I take you back to sea a little bit? I was really struck in your account of how inexpert and ill-experienced that crew was on a boat of that nature, undertaking an expedition of that kind. That strikes me as an extraordinarily reckless thing to do.
Yeah, it's shocking when you read the account of, especially the leg from San Francisco to Hawaii. It's and then going to the Marquesas Islands where they almost run out of water, and I mean, it was very dangerous. They did not plan it out well. It's kind of shocking, and they tell quite a different story in other accounts, but there were some real close calls where they could have died.
Yeah, I'm sure. So there's a question here about the musical dimension. Nancy points out that your biography really emphasizes Charmian's skill as a pianist. Do you know whether there are more details on what composers and genres of classical music that she particularly enjoyed?
There are. They do still have her piano at the park, and they'll give concerts of the music that she liked to play. I don't offhand know the actual songs that she would she liked to play at these concerts, but she was classically trained at Mills College.
So that's where her training comes from, right?
Yes, I mean, she did learn when she learned from her aunt when she was younger, who had an Etsy piano in their home, but she really kind of engaged with it when she was at Mills, and then continued to practice with she had a tutor for many, until basically she got married to Jack. She was practicing all the time. And then while she actually was married, she kept playing all the way until her hands became too arthritic in the late 1940s, and she wasn't able to play anymore. But until then, I mean, she recorded in her diary every day, like how far she walked, how many hours of piano she played, everything, what books she read. what the weather was like.
Thank you. And then just a point of clarification for those in the audience who are less familiar with the geographical context. So where exactly is the park?
Great. Yeah, the park is actually in Northern California, north of San Francisco, about 60 miles north, in a town called Glen Ellen. It's near Santa Rosa. And it is it's a very small town, but it's where Jack and Charmian live. The Wake Robin Lodge is there, but it's now a private residence. And then the Jack London State Park is there as well.
Terrific, thank you. So having devoted 6 years of your life to this project, and finally having seen it published and watching it go out into the world, setting it forth in the world as we do, what's next?
Well, I've already begun work on my next biography, which will be on the writer Sonora Babb. Sonora Babb was a incredible writer, very much a Western writer. She was born in Oklahoma while it was still a territory. And she moved to LA in 1929, just a week before the stock market crashed. She moved here to be a reporter and then was immediately fired. But she found her way into this amazing writing group, was in a writing group with Ray Bradbury, and she was ended up working at the farm security the farm security camps, the weed patch camp, and was taking notes. She was the camp manager, and she worked with Tom Collins, taking notes on all the people who came to the camp. And she was really able to connect with them. And so she started at night writing a novel, got a great book contract with Random House, and was going to be flown out that summer to write the book. And this young writer came to visit her, and Tom, and named John Steinbeck, and she gave him her notes to borrow, to use, and willingly. And then he ended up writing The Grapes of Wrath, which became an immediate bestseller, won a Pulitzer Prize. And she flew back to New York and was finishing her novel, and then got called into the office. And Bennett Cerf, who was her editor, was like, "I'm really sorry, this is a great book, but we just can't publish it because this other book is, doing so well, and no one's going to want a second story about the Dust Bowl."
Wow.
And so what happened was, because of that, we really have a single story of what the Dust Bowl was like. And
wow.
My grandmother came over in the Dust Bowl from Oklahoma, and was always growing up saying, she would say to me, she's like, the Grapes of Wrath is totally wrong. And I was like, crazy grandma, but she was actually right. So,
but that question about the relationship between the male and female perspective begs another question about the relationship between Jack and Charmian. So Maggie asks, did Jack ask her to review his writings at all before he sent them to an editor or publisher? So what role did she have in the construction of his prose?
That's a great question, and it's an important question that I take on in the book. When they started working together on his books as early as The Sea Wolf, she helped with taking the she helped type up the manuscript for him, and then helped convert it into for magazine publication to send it out as a novel. And so every one of her books of his books she typed up, but she also provided some editorial feedback, and then that got greater and greater, so that in his beginning with Valley of the Moon, she actually wrote whole passages, because they did the research together,
Right.
going up and down the California coast, doing research, and they were on the Dirigo together writing it. And you'll see in Saxon, because of it, the protagonist in that novel is really a strong woman, is probably one of the most believable female characters of the time period. And the reason why is because she was partially written by a woman.
Right. That makes perfect sense. And I guess that's the appropriate note on which to close. So I'd like to thank everybody for joining us this evening. Thank you for your consistent support of our programs. But most of all, on your behalf, I'd like to thank Iris for a really rather beautiful and poignant presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Good night, everybody. Thank you for joining us.